In this episode, we are going to tell you what the geoglyphs on the plains were used for. In the previous episode, I spoke about how the geoglyphs on the hills helped travelers cross the desert and reach their destination. But regarding the geoglyphs situated on the plains, it's a whole different story, because their function is completely different. Those continuous lines that they are made of fulfills a technical requirement rather than an aesthetic preference. By that, I mean that they didn't build them that way thinking that they were prettier or they were bigger, but rather because it was the only way they could make them work. But why are we so sure that this was the only way? What did they want to do with these geoglyphs? Well, it served to indicate, not meant for their own people, but for the eyes of an expert overseer who knew exactly what he was doing. Said overseer was in charge of supplying the water to irrigate the fields. He was in charge of opening and closing the locks that supplied the water to the different canals of the irrigation circuit. Something extremely important. It is vital to understand that the Nazca lines were a gigantic flood irrigation system. In an irrigation system like this, the irrigation canals are flooded to get the water reaching everywhere. While the canals are being flooded, the water moves through the circuit following its intended path, reaching all parts of the canal circuit without overflowing. Afterwards, the water is left in the small canals to be gradually absorbed by the ground. But there is a limit. If you let the water continue to flow into the circuit unimpeded, eventually it will exceed its limit and it will overflow. And that's where the geoglyphs come in, to prevent this from happening, knowing that without them it would be a catastrophe for the crops. Those continuous lines that make up the geoglyphs were small superficial canals, where only a small amount of water could enter. That's why they were continuous lines, given that the water had to be able to circulate along the whole length of it. And how did they prevent the circuit from flooding? This is quite more complex. The depth of the main canals of the structures where it accumulated, and also of the flood irrigation canals, was greater than that of the geoglyphs. However, these figures were very shallow in depth. If you want an example of that, take a look at a gigantic rectangle in the middle of the plain where the spider is. The spider is not what matters for the moment, since for that case it becomes a little bit more complex. However, you'll see that on one side there's also a geoglyph in the shape of a flower. This flower is directly connected to that rectangle. While the rectangle holds quite a lot of depth, the flower does not. It's in fact very shallow. Imagine what happens if the rectangle fills up with water. As long as the water doesn't reach all the way to the top, it won't flow into the canal that forms part of the flower. Now, I'm telling you things that academics didn't know until a year ago, so as you can see, this is quite the history in the making. So when the rectangle was full to the brim, the water reached all the way to the top, up to the height of where the flower canal laid, which started to fill up. And as it filled up, the flower started to do something incredible. It started to change colour. This was because the sand at the bottom was getting soaked. And not only that, but the water that was flowing through that flower-shaped canal began to glow in the desert sun. That was all noticed by the expert eyes of the overseer who was on the hill. And this warned him that it was time to immediately close the floodgates that were sending out the water. Otherwise, in the case he didn't, that gigantic structure would have begun to overflow, causing a terrible flood. I will continue to let you in on more about this gigantic and ingenious system in the following episodes. Subscribe, hit the like button and share the videos. That way you encourage us to continue our work in spreading the word. See you on the next video.
Solo en YouTube.